January 2024. A door breaks out of a Boeing 737 MAX during the flight. Once again, the American aircraft manufacturer is in the headlines. Even in the years before things went downhill for Boeing 2 crashes, 346 dead and $20 billion in losses, plus a destroyed reputation that was the price Boeing had to pay for the serious mistakes in their latest aircraft model. You might think that now would be the perfect time for this huge company to compete, but the last time that really happened was in 1970, when a group of European companies called Airbus wanted to seriously compete with the Americans. Impossible at the time. Today, almost 50 years later, Airbus has not only caught up with Boeing, they currently deliver more aircraft from than their competitor, but no other company has managed to do so since 1970. No matter how many times you have flown in your life, the probability is huge that you have never sat in an aircraft that was not either from Airbus or Boeing. These two companies control far more than 90% of the market for passenger aircraft. Why aren't there many different companies competing with each other, as is the case with car manufacturers? And why are there only these two companies in the aircraft industry? They have managed to dominate the market. Hi, my name is Jenny, and I took a look at what it would cost to set up a new aircraft manufacturer today. Let's do a little thought experiment. Imagine you were to set up your own. Just imagine you were to found your own aircraft manufacturer, one that could compete with Airbus and Boeing. Of course, that sounds like an exciting challenge at first. So let's take a look at what you would need to do that. You would need a team of the best engineers in the world. But we're talking about thousands of highly specialized experts: aerodynamicists, material scientists, electrical engineers, software developers, safety experts. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. These experts don't spend a few months developing an aircraft, but years. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner, one of the best-selling long-haul aircraft in the world, took 8 years from announcement to its first commercial flight. This was despite being developed by engineers with decades of experience. Even if the best team in the world were to work for you for free, you wouldn't get very far without the necessary capital. The development costs for a modern commercial aircraft are enormous. The Boeing 787, for example, cost a whopping $32 billion to develop. That's more than the gross domestic product of Iceland, or, to make a particularly painful comparison, 4 times as much as Berlin's airport would cost, including delays. You have to invest this amount before you earn a single penny. If I had that much money, I wouldn't think of putting it all on one card. To maybe, just maybe, earn a little more money in the end. Once an aircraft has been developed and a prototype built, the certification marathon begins. Aviation authorities are among the strictest regulatory authorities in the world, and for good reason. Every single part of an aircraft must undergo a complex process to guarantee its safety. The software must be developed in accordance with DO 178, one of the strictest standards in the world. In addition, thousands of tests under all conceivable conditions are necessary. For example, heat, cold, rain, storms, lightning strikes. Your aircraft must prove that it can withstand everything. Then, of course, you also need a factory, but not just any factory. The Boeing factory in Everest, for example, is the largest building in the world in terms of volume. Its area of approximately 400,000 square meters is equivalent to the size of 75 football fields. But even if you have overcome all these hurdles and easily taken on $100 billion in debt, perhaps the biggest challenge is yet to come. You have to convince the airlines to buy your aircraft. It's not just about the purchase price. Airlines invest in a long-term relationship. They need to be able to rely on you to still be able to supply spare parts and provide service in 20 or 30 years' time. This means that you also have to build up a global network of repair stations. Another critical point is training. Pilots and maintenance technicians must be specially trained for your aircraft. So you also need a comprehensive training program, simulators, and training centers around the world. Airlines will only buy your aircraft if they can be sure that you have really done everything to supply them forever, and only if you are significantly cheaper than the competition. You also have to maintain the reputation you have built up. A single serious incident can undermine decades of work, as Boeing experienced firsthand with the 737 MAX disaster. So if I can give you some well-meaning advice, if you have $100 billion lying around, then don't become an aircraft manufacturer, no matter how tempting it is. Let's be honest, no one would ever think of starting an aircraft factory. No matter how much money they have lying around, the reason why Airbus exists today is not because a few entrepreneurs got together, but because the countries France, Germany, and Great Britain wanted it that way, and provided substantial financial support. Airbus received incredibly favorable loans at the beginning. These loans only had to be repaid if they could somehow afford to do so. I would also like to have a loan like that. To this day, both Boeing and Airbus still receive very strong government support. Enormous barriers to entry and ongoing risk explain relatively well why no manufacturer from the private sector has entered this market. Even companies such as Lockheed Martin, which had previously come very close, and decades of experience in aircraft construction, have had to throw in the towel, have exited the commercial market. Other companies have been taken over by either Boeing or Airbus, and the few remaining manufacturers focus either on small regional aircraft or on private aircraft. But it's not as if Boeing and Airbus can coexist peacefully. In fact, a competition between Europe and the US has been played out on their backs for decades. This competition is not just about supremacy in the air. What began as a story of David versus Goliath is now a battle between Goliath and Goliath. This is only because France, Germany, Great Britain, and later Spain pumped billions of euros into the Airbus project. Even after Airbus was transformed from a group of companies into a supposedly normal private company. Even after Airbus was converted from a group of companies into a supposedly normal private company in 2000, this did not stop. Airbus does not receive any direct money, but something that is almost as good. Namely, repayable government startup financing. Or, as I like to call it, free games. Just like in a casino, this is how it works. The state grants a loan to finance the development of a new type of aircraft. However, the money only has to be repaid if the project is successful. If not, there are no costs for Airbus and they can simply spin the slot machine again, until they finally develop a successful aircraft. With such government interference, it was hardly surprising that Boeing, in the constant competitive struggle, eventually lost its temper. The former CEO publicly accused Airbus of abusing a 1992 agreement to manipulate the market with free spins. But those who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. And so Airbus's lawyers began to dig a little deeper. Because Boeing itself benefited massively from government support. This is just a little better hidden. Military contracts worth billions, NASA research funds, and generous tax breaks from states. The U.S. federal city of Washington alone granted Boeing a tax break worth $8.7 billion over 40 years. That is more than the entire development budget for some aircraft models. So unfair means were used on both sides of the Atlantic. In 2005, the conflict escalated when the U.S. sued the EU before the World Trade Organization, WTO. Less than 24 hours later, the EU also filed a counterclaim. What followed was the biggest trade dispute in the history of the World Trade Organization. After 15 years of litigation, the sobering result was that both sides had violated the rules. As punishment, they were allowed to impose tariffs. As a result, the conflict reached a new peak in 2019. The U.S. imposed punitive tariffs on European goods worth $7.5 billion. The official reason was the illegal Airbus subsidies. In addition to aircraft, the tariffs also applied to wine, whiskey, olive oil, and cheese. However, I could find no evidence that the EU had illegally supported the development of new high-risk cheese varieties. The EU retaliated with tariffs on U.S. goods worth $4 billion, of course not only on aircraft, but also on peanut butter, ketchup, tractors, and motorcycles. It was a real trade war, and Boeing and Airbus were right in the middle of it. Who pays for it in the end? The airlines, of course, and ultimately the passengers. The artificially high prices caused by the duopoly and the additional costs caused by the trade war are passed on. It's a vicious circle that shows how closely politics and economics are intertwined in the aviation industry. It wasn't until 2021 that the US and the EU agreed on a 5-year truce. Both sides are suspending their punitive tariffs. But while I'm still recording this video, that could already change again, because since Trump is back in office, the next trade conflict is probably only a matter of time. This decades-long conflict between Airbus and Boeing has shown us that in Europe or the US, there will certainly be no other major aircraft manufacturer. However, the conflict also distracts a little from the fact that there may be a chance that this duopoly will eventually be broken. This is because another aircraft manufacturer has been created far to the east. Here, the People's Republic of China is developing a competitor to Airbus and Boeing, with the Commercial Aircraft Corporation of China, or COMAC, for short. The second largest economy build its own champion in aircraft construction, just as it has already done in other industries. Here, no effort is made to hide state subsidies. Nevertheless, the figures are impressive. COMAC has already received $72 billion in state support in just 15 years. China is therefore serious about this, while Boeing and Airbus have sued each other before the World Trade Organization, WTO. So China is serious. While Boeing and Airbus have sued each other before the WTO and each has to justify its subsidies, COMAC enjoys a decisive advantage as a Chinese state-owned enterprise and does not have to justify itself to anyone. No WTO lawsuit, no international trade court could force China to disclose its subsidy policy. This creates a whole new set of rules. Western manufacturers must make every dollar and euro of government support transparent and justify it. China, on the other hand, can pump unlimited funds into its aviation company. So if anywhere in the world an aircraft manufacturer could emerge, it would be here. COMAC's flagship is the C919, an aircraft designed to compete directly with the Airbus A320 and Boeing 737. On paper, everything looks promising: state-of-the-art technology, efficient engines, 168 seats. Perfect for the growing Chinese market, COMAC has already received over 1,000 orders for the C919. But a closer look reveals the true picture. Almost all orders come from Chinese airlines and leasing companies, with no international customers. One of the biggest weaknesses is the enormous dependence on Western technologies. The engines come from CFM International, a French-American joint venture. The electrical engineering comes from Honeywell in the USA. Even important components for the cockpit and landing gear come from Western suppliers. This dependence makes COMAC vulnerable, especially in times of geopolitical tension. But it would not be the first time that China has started out this way and gradually replaced Western components with Chinese ones. Currently, a trade dispute or export restriction would be enough to bring the entire production to a standstill. Even more critical is the issue of international certification. So far, the C919 is only allowed to fly in China itself. For international use, it needs approval from the American FAA and the European Aviation Authority. This process can take years. While Airbus and Boeing can deliver hundreds of aircraft annually, COMAC is still struggling with the basics of mass production. In 2024, only 9 C999s are expected to be delivered. Airbus produces more aircraft per week. Experts estimate that by 2030, COMAC may be able to build 70 aircraft per year. This would correspond to approximately the monthly production of Airbus's A320 models. But COMAC is pursuing a strategy that could actually work, even if it takes a little longer. First, it will conquer the domestic market. First, conquer the domestic market, and then Southeast Asia. The first demonstration flights outside China therefore went to Singapore, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Malaysia, and Indonesia. The C919 could find its first international customers in these markets. By 2030, COMAC could capture about 8% of the Chinese aircraft market. Globally, that is just 1.2%. That may not sound like much at first, but in a market of this size, even a small market share means billions in sales. It would definitely be a mistake to underestimate the Chinese in ramping up their capacities. Unlike Airbus or Boeing, China has no shortage of labor, and no problem with financing, so it could well be that the duopoly will become a triopoly in a few years. And if we have learned one thing from this, it is that there are definitely better ideas than starting an aircraft company, at least if you don't have good connections in politics. What is always a good idea in any case